April 12, 1945. Harry Truman becomes President of the United States. It happens suddenly. President Franklin Roosevelt has died. Now, Truman is in charge. Within weeks, he starts making big changes. He is systematically firing people. He is forcing out almost everyone who worked closely with Franklin Roosevelt. Cabinet members are let go. White House staff are replaced. Advisors and confidants are shown the door. Truman is cleaning house. He is establishing his own team. He is refusing to be a mere caretaker for Roosevelt's legacy. But there is one man who stays. One Roosevelt appointee Truman doesn't touch. One figure from the old administration remains untouchable. He does not fade away. Instead, he grows more powerful with each passing year. His name is Edgar Hoover. He is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover had run the FBI since 1924. He had served under Roosevelt for 12 long years. He was exactly the kind of entrenched Roosevelt loyalist that Truman was purging everywhere else. But Truman did not fire him. He did not even try. Hoover would remain the FBI director for another 27 years. He would outlast Truman himself. He would outlast 4 more presidents. He served until his death in 1972. Why? What made Edgar Hoover so different? Why was this one man untouchable when everyone else was expendable? The answer is both simple and terrifying. It is because Hoover knew where all the bodies were buried. He knew this literally, and he knew it figuratively. And Harry Truman understood a basic, grim truth. Some enemies are too dangerous to make. Let's start with who Edgar Hoover actually was in 1945. The man Truman inherited was already a monster. He was just a monster most Americans did not recognize yet. Hoover had joined the Justice Department in 1917. He was right out of law school. He made his name during the Red Scare. This was from 1919 to 1920. He organized raids that rounded up thousands of people. They were suspected radicals, anarchists, and communists. He did not care much for legal niceties. Things like warrants or solid evidence did not slow him down. He cared about results. And he got them. By 1924, he was only 29 years old. He was appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation. This agency would become the FBI in 1935. For the next 21 years, Hoover built the FBI into his personal empire. He recruited agents who were loyal to him personally. Their loyalty was not just to the Bureau. He established systems for gathering intelligence. He spied on politicians. He watched activists and journalists. He tracked anyone who might be useful or dangerous to him. He cultivated relationships with friendly reporters. These reporters would print stories exactly as Hoover wanted them told. Most importantly, Hoover understood something most government officials did not. He knew that information is power. Not just information about criminals. Information about everyone. Especially information about the powerful. During the Roosevelt years, Hoover expanded the FBI's job far beyond criminal investigation. He convinced Roosevelt that the Bureau needed to conduct domestic intelligence operations. This was to protect national security. That meant investigating suspected spies, saboteurs, and subversives. But Hoover's definition of subversive was extremely broad. Civil rights activists were subversive. Labor organizers were subversive. Anti-war protesters were subversive. Left-wing intellectuals were subversive. And anyone who criticized the FBI, they were definitely subversive. Hoover built files on all of them. He also built files on powerful politicians, congressmen, senators, cabinet members, even Supreme Court justices. He had files on presidents. These files contained everything. They held details of affairs and financial irregularities. They noted embarrassing associations and recorded private conversations. They contained anything that could be used as leverage if necessary. Roosevelt knew about this. He had actually encouraged it, to some extent. Roosevelt was a master manipulator. He appreciated having damaging information about his opponents. But Roosevelt also understood that he needed to keep Hoover on a leash. He met with Hoover regularly. He maintained the relationship. He made sure Hoover knew who was boss. When Truman became president, he he walked into a very different situation. He did not have Roosevelt's personal relationship with Hoover. He did not have Roosevelt's huge political capital. He was an accidental president. He was a man nobody had really wanted as vice president. Now he was president, trying to establish authority over a government that did not fully respect him. And Edgar Hoover had a file on him. We do not know exactly what was in Truman's FBI file. The most sensitive files were destroyed after Hoover's death. But we know Hoover had one. He had files on everyone. We can make educated guesses about what it might have contained. Truman got his start in politics through the Pendergast machine in Kansas City. This was one of the most corrupt political organizations in America. Tom Pendergast ran Kansas City like a personal fiefdom. He controlled votes through patronage, intimidation, and fraud. He skimmed money from city contracts. He protected organized crime in exchange for payoffs. And Harry Truman owed his Senate seat to Pendergast's support. Truman himself was not particularly corrupt. He was not corrupt by the standards of machine politics. He did not personally steal money. He did not take obvious bribes. But he was part of the system. He attended Pendergast's meetings. He voted the way Pendergast wanted. He helped Pendergast's allies get federal appointments. The association was enough to taint him. Hoover's FBI had investigated Pendergast in the late 1930s. They built a case for tax evasion. That case sent Pendergast to federal prison in 1939. During that investigation, they documented all of Pendergast's political connections. That included Harry Truman. So, when Truman became president in 1945, Hoover had detailed records. They showed Truman's relationship with a convicted political boss. Nothing in there proved Truman himself was corrupt. But it was enough to raise serious questions. It was enough to cause major problems if it became public. It was enough to make Truman think twice about making an enemy of Edgar Hoover. There was probably more. Truman had a reputation as a heavy drinker. He enjoyed poker games and off-colored jokes. His marriage to Bess Truman was solid. But there were rumors about his younger days. Nothing scandalous by modern standards. But in 1945, even minor personal indiscretions could destroy a political career. That is, if the right people wanted to use them. Hoover specialized in collecting exactly that kind of information. Not necessarily illegal activity. Just embarrassing personal details that people wanted kept private. And he had decades of practice. He was an expert at letting powerful people know he had information. He could do this without ever explicitly threatening them. Truman's first meeting with Hoover as president would have been fascinating to witness. Two men who both understood exactly what was happening. Neither one saying it out loud. Hoover would have been respectful, deferential, professional. He would have briefed Truman on national security matters. He would have offered the FBI's full cooperation. He would have expressed loyalty to the new president. And somehow, probably without ever stating it explicitly, he would have made one thing clear. He had information Truman would prefer stayed private. The FBI's files were extensive and detailed. Hoover had survived 6 previous presidents. He planned to survive this one, too. Trying to fire him would be a very, very big mistake. Truman was nobody's fool. He had spent years in the rough world of politics. He understood how power worked. He understood what Hoover was telling him without words. And he made a calculation. Edgar Hoover was not worth fighting. Think about what that meant. Truman had just fired dozens of powerful people. Cabinet members who had been with Roosevelt for years. White House advisors who had helped win World War II. These were men with real accomplishments and genuine loyalty. But he would not touch Hoover. Why? Because those other people could not destroy him. Hoover could. There was another factor that made Hoover untouchable. It was public opinion. By 1945, Edgar Hoover was a national hero to most Americans. The FBI had successfully investigated famous kidnapping cases in the 1930s. They had caught Nazi spies during the war. Hoover had carefully cultivated an image. He was America's top cop. He was the incorruptible defender of law and order. Hollywood made movies glorifying the FBI. Radio shows dramatized their cases. Newspapers printed glowing profiles of Hoover and his G-men. To the average American, Edgar Hoover was a patriot. He was the man who kept the country safe. Truman knew that firing Hoover would look terrible. It would raise immediate questions. People would ask, what is Truman hiding? Why is he firing the one man who keeps us safe? It would make enemies of law enforcement supporters across the country. It would hand Republicans a perfect attack line. They could say, Truman is soft on crime. He is firing the one man who keeps America safe. So, Truman kept him. But he did not trust him. And he did not give him more power if he could avoid it. One of Truman's first big decisions about intelligence was to create the Central Intelligence Agency. This happened in 1947. The CIA would handle all foreign intelligence. This work had previously been scattered across various agencies, including the FBI. Hoover fought this decision viciously. He wanted the FBI to control all intelligence, both domestic and foreign. Truman refused. He had seen what Hoover had done with domestic intelligence. He was not going to give him international operations, too. The CIA would be separate. It would be independent. And, crucially, it would not be run by Edgar Hoover. This was as close as Truman came to challenging Hoover directly. And even then, he was not taking power away from Hoover. He was just refusing to give him more. Hoover kept the FBI. He kept his domestic intelligence operations. He kept his files and his power. Truman just made sure he did not expand further. Their relationship was cold and correct. Truman would meet with Hoover when it was necessary. He would receive his briefings. He would approve operations. But there was no warmth between them. There was no personal relationship. Truman once said privately that he thought Hoover was dangerous. He said the FBI had too much power. But he never said this publicly. And he never did anything about it. The 1948 presidential election showed exactly why Hoover was so dangerous. Truman was running for election in his own right. He faced very long odds against the Republican candidate, Thomas Dewey. The campaign was brutal. Republicans attacked Truman as incompetent. They said he was corrupt. They said he was soft on communism. During the campaign, information started leaking to the press. It was about Truman's old association with Tom Pendergast. Old photos surfaced of Truman with Pendergast. Details about the Pendergast machine's operations were published. There were constant reminders that Truman had been the senator from Pendergast before the boss went to prison. Where did this information come from? It probably came from multiple sources. But the FBI had the most complete files on Pendergast. And Hoover had a long history of making strategic leaks to favored journalists. The leaks were not devastating enough to destroy Truman. But they kept him on the defensive. They reminded him of his political vulnerability. Truman won the election anyway. He pulled off the greatest upset in American political history. But he understood the message. Hoover could have leaked much more. Hoover could have destroyed him if he had wanted to. The fact that he had been restrained was almost a courtesy. It was a reminder of who really held the power. After the election, Truman's position was stronger. He had won in his own right. He had a mandate. He could have moved against Hoover then, if ever there was a time. But he did not. Because winning one election did not change the fundamental reality. Hoover still had files on everyone. And making a permanent enemy of him was still too risky. The early Cold War years cemented Hoover's power. As fears of communist infiltration grew, the FBI's counterintelligence work became more important. Hoover positioned himself as America's chief defender against the Red Menace. He testified before Congress about communist threats. He fed information to anti-communist crusaders like Senator Joseph McCarthy. Truman despised McCarthy. He thought the senator was a demagogue and a liar. He believed McCarthy was destroying innocent people's lives with baseless accusations. But Hoover and McCarthy were allies. Hoover provided McCarthy with FBI intelligence. McCarthy used this information in his witch hunts. And Truman could not stop it. He could not stop it without confronting Hoover directly. And that was something he would not do. This created an impossible situation. Truman wanted to contain McCarthy's excesses. But McCarthy's information came from Hoover. And Hoover was untouchable. So, McCarthyism raged through American society. It destroyed careers and ruined lives. And President Truman could only watch. He issued occasional rebukes, but they accomplished nothing. Hoover also used the Red Scare to expand the FBI's power even further. He launched operations called COINTELPRO against suspected communist organizations. These were not just investigations. They were active measures. The FBI infiltrated the organizations. They spread disinformation. They sabotaged meetings. They got people fired from their jobs. This was domestic political warfare. It was conducted by a government agency with no real oversight. Truman probably did not know the full extent of what Hoover was doing. The FBI director was skilled at keeping his most controversial operations hidden from the president. But Truman knew enough to be concerned. He just was not willing to confront Hoover about it. There is a story, which might be made up, about Truman and Hoover near the end of Truman's presidency. According to the story, someone asked Truman why he did not just fire Hoover. Truman supposedly replied, "I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out, than outside the tent pissing in." Whether or not Truman actually said this, it captures his thinking perfectly. Hoover, as the FBI director, was dangerous but manageable. You had to deal with him carefully. You could not give him too much power. You had to watch him constantly. But at least he was formally part of the administration. He was theoretically subject to presidential authority. Hoover outside the government would have been much worse. He would have been free to release whatever files he wanted. He could destroy people without any constraints. That would have been a true nightmare. So, Truman kept him inside the tent. And he tried his best to limit the damage. When Truman left office in 1953, Hoover had been FBI director for 29 years. He would continue for 19 more years. He served through the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. Every one of those presidents faced the same calculation Truman had faced. They all decided that firing Hoover was too dangerous. Eisenhower was a 5-star general. He had commanded all Allied forces in Europe during World War II. Yet, he was too intimidated to fire Hoover. John F. Kennedy had massive popularity and political capital. He would not touch Hoover. Lyndon Johnson was one of the most ruthless political operators in American history. He kept Hoover on. Even Richard Nixon, who eventually destroyed his own presidency through abuse of power, never seriously considered removing Hoover. Why? Because Hoover had files on all of them. He knew the details of Kennedy's many affairs. He had evidence of Johnson's corruption. He had investigated Nixon's shady financial dealings. Every president faced the same situation Truman faced in 1945. Making an enemy of J. Edgar Hoover could end your presidency. The result was nearly 50 years of unchecked power. Hoover built the FBI into a surveillance state within a democratic state. He spied on civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. He targeted anti-war protesters and feminist organizations. He investigated anyone he considered subversive. He used FBI resources to blackmail politicians. He intimidated critics. He became effectively immune to democratic accountability. And it all started with Truman's decision not to fire him in 1945. You cannot entirely blame Truman for this. He was in an impossible position. Hoover had spent decades building his empire. Truman inherited a situation he did not create. Firing Hoover might have been political suicide. And there was no guarantee it would actually reduce Hoover's power. He might have leaked everything from the outside. But Truman's decision established a powerful precedent. It proved that Hoover was untouchable. It showed every future president that confronting Hoover was too dangerous. It allowed Hoover to continue building his power, year after year. He became a force that no elected official could control. Think about what that means for a democracy. The FBI director is supposed to serve the president. He is supposed to serve the American people. The FBI is supposed to be accountable to elected leadership. But Hoover inverted that relationship. Presidents served at Hoover's pleasure, not the other way around. He was accountable to no one. Truman understood this was wrong. He said privately that allowing any government official to become that powerful was dangerous. He warned that intelligence agencies needed strong oversight and clear limitations. But he did not act on those beliefs when it came to Hoover. There is a painful irony here. Truman was willing to fire General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was one of the most popular military leaders in American history. He challenged civilian control of the military. Truman's decision to fire him was politically devastating. Truman's approval ratings collapsed. Republicans called for his impeachment. But Truman did it anyway. He did it because he believed civilian control of the military was fundamental to democracy. But he would not fire Edgar Hoover. Hoover was doing far more damage to democratic norms than MacArthur ever did. Why the difference? Because MacArthur could not destroy Truman personally. He could hurt Truman politically, but he did not have files full of personal secrets. Hoover did. So, Truman made a choice. He was willing to sacrifice his political standing to uphold a principle when it came to MacArthur. But he was willing to sacrifice a principle to protect himself when it came to Hoover. It is an understandable human decision. But it is also a failure of leadership. And that failure had consequences for decades. After Hoover finally died in 1972, investigators tried to figure out what was in his secret files. Most of the worst files had been destroyed. Hoover's personal secretary destroyed multiple file cabinets full of documents before anyone could stop her. What survived showed systematic abuse. There were files on politicians' sex lives. There were investigations of civil rights leaders designed solely to discredit them. The COINTELPRO operations had violated civil liberties on a massive scale. Reforms finally followed. Congress passed laws limiting FBI directors to 10-year terms. Oversight was strengthened. The FBI was forced to operate under clearer rules. But these reforms came nearly 50 years too late. They came after Hoover had poisoned American democracy for half a century. And it all traced back to Harry Truman's decision in 1945. Not because Truman created the problem, but because he was the first president after Roosevelt who could have solved it. He was the one who chose not to. He was the moment when someone could have said, "Enough." And he didn't. Truman made that choice for understandable reasons. He was in a weak position politically. He had vulnerabilities that Hoover could exploit. The political costs of firing Hoover seemed impossibly high. But understanding why Truman made that choice does not mean accepting that it was right. Because here is the thing about standing up to bullies. Someone has to do it eventually. And it is always going to be costly. It is always going to hurt. A bully has power for one reason. They have made it dangerous to confront them. Waiting for a safe moment to confront a bully means never confronting them. They never allow a safe moment to exist. Truman was willing to accept political damage over MacArthur. He believed in the principle of civilian control. He should have been willing to accept political damage over Hoover. He believed in the principle of democratic accountability for intelligence agencies. He said he believed in it. He just would not pay the price to defend it. That is the real lesson of why Truman refused to fire Edgar Hoover. It was not just that Hoover was too powerful to fire, though he was. It was not just that the political costs were too high, though they were. It is that when principles conflict with personal survival, even good leaders often choose survival. And when enough leaders make that choice, you end up with someone like Edgar Hoover. A man who understood that fear is the ultimate power. And he used that fear without restraint for half a century. Harry Truman was a good president in many ways. He made tough decisions. He stood up to powerful interests. He defended democracy against threats from abroad and at home. But he failed when it came to Edgar Hoover. He knew Hoover was dangerous. He knew the FBI had too much power. He knew something needed to be done. And he did not do it. Because Edgar Hoover was the one Roosevelt man he feared. And fear, in the end, was what kept Hoover in power.